Rich Ponce believed that money was the only language the world understood, and he spoke it fluently. He never expected that a 7-year-old boy in rags was about to silence him with a single number that made Rich's billion-dollar empire look like a rounding error. The morning sun reflected off the glass towers of the financial district, but inside the Grand Imperial Bank, the air was cold and elite. Rich stood at the mahogany counter, the sharp crease of his charcoal suit and the glint of his luxury watch serving as armor in a world he firmly commanded. He was a man who thrived on status and intimidation, and today he found a target that made his own success feel even more pronounced. The contrast was staggering. Rich's $5,000 suit, crafted from the finest wool, stood in stark opposition to the small, shivering figure of John Wayman. John's oversized t-shirt was more holes than fabric, and his face was streaked with deep-set soot that suggested he hadn't seen a bathtub in a week. While Rich smelled of expensive wood polish and power, the boy carried the scent of the street and the desperation of the ignored. Rich looked at his own perfectly polished Italian leather shoes, and then at John's feet. The boy's sneakers were 2 sizes too big, held together by desperate layers of grey duct tape that squeaked against the pristine marble floor. Every sound John made was an affront to the dignified silence of the bank, a signal to everyone present that he did not belong among the crystal chandeliers and high-end mahogany. In John's small, grimy hand, he clutched a crumpled slip of paper as if it were a lifeline. To Rich, it looked like a piece of trash salvaged from a rainy gutter, but to John, it was the fulfillment of a mysterious promise. Rich pointed a manicured finger at the boy, his laughter echoing off the high ceilings as he prepared to turn this visual discrepancy into a public performance. He didn't see a child. He saw a nuisance and a street rat that had accidentally wandered in from the heat outside. Rich turned to the bank teller with a cruel smirk, his voice dripping with mock concern. He was the king of this lobby, and he was about to make sure that everyone, especially the boy, knew exactly where they stood in his simple hierarchy of power. Rich Ponce further establishes his dominance and begins belittling John to entertain the elite crowd. Rich Ponce stood in the center of the Grand Imperial Bank lobby, a space that felt less like a financial institution and more like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of the dollar. The morning light filtered through 60-foot windows, caught the sharp crease of his charcoal suit and the glint of a watch that cost more than a suburban home. To Rich, the world was a simple hierarchy of those who had and those who were had, and he was firmly at the peak. He drew in a breath of the air-conditioned atmosphere, which smelled of expensive wood polish and the quiet, sterile scent of immense power. That power was currently being insulted by a smudge on the scenery. Standing near the VIP counter was a boy who looked like he had been pulled directly out of a gutter, John Wayman. John was small, his frame nearly swallowed by a tattered, oversized t-shirt that was more holes than fabric. His face was streaked with the kind of deep-set soot that suggested he hadn't seen a bathtub in a week. In his small, trembling hand, he clutched a piece of paper that looked like it had been salvaged from a rainy street. Rich Ponce couldn't help himself. He lived for moments where he could reaffirm his status by crushing someone else's. He began to laugh, a loud, sharp sound that cut through the dignified silence of the bank. He looked around, catching the eyes of a woman draped in pearls and a man in a 3-piece suit, inviting them into his performance. "Janet," Rich called out to the receptionist, his voice dripping with mock concern. "I think there's been a security breach. Since when did we start allowing the local wildlife to wander into a private institution?" He gestured with a manicured hand toward John, who shrank back, his eyes fixed on his worn-out sneakers, which were held together by layers of grey duct tape. The lobby grew quiet as the other clients stopped their business to watch. Rich walked in a slow, predatory circle around the boy, his Italian leather shoes clicking with rhythmic authority against the marble floor. He leaned down, placing his hands on his knees so he was eye-level with the boy, though his expression remained one of pure, amused disdain. "Tell me, kid," Rich sneered, loud enough for the back of the room to hear. "Are you lost, or did you come in here hoping to find some spare change in the cushions? This isn't a soup kitchen. People in here don't deal in nickels, we deal in empires." John didn't look up. He simply held the crumpled paper tighter, his knuckles turning white through the grime. His silence only emboldened Rich, who turned back to his audience with a wide theatrical grin. "Look at him," Rich continued, turning the boy into a prop for his ego. "He's got a piece of paper. What is that, John? Your resume? Or maybe a letter from your mother asking for a loan so you can buy a shirt without holes in it?" A ripple of mean-spirited laughter spread through the lobby. The woman with the pearls covered her mouth, her eyes sparkling with the same elitist delight that fueled Rich's cruelty. Rich felt the familiar rush of dominance. He was the king of this lobby, the master of this domain, and this dirty child was nothing more than a convenient tool to prove how far he had risen above the common street. He didn't see a human being. He saw a nuisance, a street rat that didn't belong in the presence of real wealth. He was so consumed by his own performance that he failed to notice the way the boy's jaw set, or the steady, quiet determination in his eyes as he took a single shaky step closer to the counter. For Rich Ponce, this was just another morning of proving his superiority, and he was determined to milk the entertainment for everything it was worth. Rich Ponce leaned against the VIP counter, his elbow resting on the polished mahogany as if he were holding court in a private club. The laughter from his previous remarks was still settling into the heavy curtains of the bank, and he could feel the eyes of the other high-net-worth clients lingering on him, waiting for the next act. He wasn't finished. The sight of the boy's trembling hands and the way he shielded that pathetic crumpled slip of paper only fed Rich's appetite for a spectacle. "You know everyone," Rich said, his voice projecting with the practiced clarity of a man who loved the sound of his own authority. "We might be witnessing a historic financial event. Look at the intensity in his eyes. Look at the way he guards that document. This isn't just a piece of paper. This is surely the map to a hidden treasure of nickels and gum wrappers." He stepped closer to John, the scent of his expensive cologne overwhelming the boy's proximity. With a terrifyingly fake friendliness, Rich placed a heavy hand on John's small, bony shoulder. The boy flinched, but Rich's grip was firm, steering him toward the massive digital monitor that stood beside the teller's station, a screen usually reserved for displaying stock tickers and private portfolio growth. "Come on now, don't be shy, young mogul," Rich crooned, his eyes glinting with predatory mischief. "If you're going to be a man of business, you have to face the numbers. Janet, clear the screen. Let's help our friend here check his holdings. I'm genuinely curious. Is there enough in there for a single piece of bubble gum, or are we looking at a catastrophic deficit of 3 cents? Rich looked over his shoulder at the woman in pearls, who let out a sharp, tittering giggle. The teller, Janet, looked down at the boy with a mixture of pity and professional hesitation, but a sharp nod from Rich, a man whose personal accounts kept this branch afloat, forced her hand. She reached out and took the grimy, folded paper from John's fingers. "The invitation is open, kid," Rich whispered, leaning down so his mouth was inches from John's soot-covered ear. "Let's show the whole room exactly what you're worth. I'll even give you a tip on how to invest your pocket change, provided the bank doesn't charge you a fee just for standing on the rug." He pushed the boy a few inches closer to the glowing screen, which sat blank and expectant. Rich felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind he usually only felt when liquidating a competitor. He wanted the screen to flash a zero. He wanted the system to reject the card. He wanted the finality of that digital access denied to be the punchline to his joke. He stood back, crossing his arms over his chest, a satisfied king waiting for the guillotine to fall on a pauper's dreams. The laughter in the lobby was a physical weight, thick and suffocating like the summer humidity John had left behind at the revolving doors. It rose in waves, fueled by Rich Ponce's cruel commentary, bouncing off the gold-leafed ceiling and the cold marble columns. To the wealthy clients watching the spectacle, John was just a bit of morning entertainment, a dash of grit against their polished reality. But John Wayman didn't hear the mockery anymore. He had learned long ago how to build a wall of silence around his heart, a skill perfected during long nights in a dark apartment, when the sound of his own stomach growling was the only company he had. As Rich's hand remained heavy on his shoulder, a mock gesture of mentorship that felt more like a brand, John reached into the deep, frayed pocket of his oversized jeans. His fingers brushed against a small rectangular object, the edges worn soft like velvet from years of constant touch. It was a photograph, his only true possession. He clutched it with a desperate intensity, drawing strength from the chemical gloss of the paper. In the photo, his mother was smiling. Her face was younger then, free of the hollow shadows that had eventually claimed her cheeks, but her eyes were the same ones John saw in the mirror every morning. She was wearing a blue uniform, a name tag pinned to her chest, standing in a hallway that looked hauntingly familiar. It was only now, standing in this cavernous lobby, that John realized where that photo had been taken. His mother hadn't just cleaned offices, she had cleaned these very floors. She had spent her nights scrubbed on her knees, polishing the very marble that Rich Ponce was currently standing on with such unearned arrogance. John remembered the smell of bleach that always clung to her skin, the way her hands were perpetually red and raw from the harsh chemicals. She used to tell him that every tile she cleaned was a step toward a door she wanted him to walk through, not as a ghost of the night shift, but as someone who belonged in the light of day. "Don't ever let them make you feel small, John," she had whispered during her final days, her voice a fragile thread.
The world is built on the backs of people like us, but it belongs to those who survive. The laughter around him seemed to dim, replaced by the memory of her quiet, steady pulse. Rich Ponce thought he was winning, thought he was the master of this moment, because his suit was expensive and his voice was loud. But John knew something Rich didn't. He knew the value of the sweat that had gone into the foundation of this building. He wasn't just a street rat who had wandered in. He was the son of the woman who had kept this temple of greed shining for a decade. He looked up at the blank monitor, the glowing light reflecting in the soot around his eyes. He wasn't afraid of the zero Rich expected to see. He wasn't afraid of the access denied or the security guards waiting in the wings. He felt the worn edge of the photograph one last time before pulling his hand away, standing an inch taller despite the weight of Rich's grip. He was a silent witness to his mother's sacrifice, and he was ready for the screen to tell the truth that no one in this room was prepared to hear.
Janet the teller hesitated, her hand hovering over the counter as if touching the scrap of paper John held out would leave a permanent stain on her pristine workstation. She looked up at Rich Ponce, seeking a sign that this joke had reached its conclusion, but Rich only gave an impatient, sweeping gesture. He was leaning back now, teeth bared in a grin that promised a grand finale. The other clients had moved closer, forming a loose semicircle of silk and wool, their hushed conversations dying away into a heavy, expectant silence. It was the kind of silence found in a courtroom just before a sentence is read, cold, judgmental, and devoid of oxygen. With a sigh of performative reluctance, Janet pinched the edge of the paper between two fingers. It was damp from the humidity of the street, and the sweat of John's palm, greyed by soot and creased into a tight, irregular square. As she unfolded it, the crinkling sound seemed unnaturally loud, echoing off the marble like a series of small gunshots. Rich chuckled, a low vibration in his chest. "Careful, Janet," he teased. "Don't lose any of that high-yield data. We wouldn't want to crash the global market over a missing digit." John stood perfectly still. The duct tape on his shoes felt like lead weights, anchoring him to the spot where his mother had once worked the midnight buffing machines. He watched Janet flatten the paper against the glass. On it was a series of handwritten numbers and a scannable barcode, the ink slightly blurred but still legible. It looked like a child's drawing of a bank document, a pathetic imitation of the high-security vouchers Rich handled daily. Janet began to type the code into her terminal. Each keystroke was a sharp, mechanical clack that punctuated the stillness. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted. The air seemed to grow thin. The mockery in the room transformed from active laughter into a tense, breathless voyeurism. Even Rich stopped talking. His eyes narrowed as he watched the loading icon spin on the monitor. He was waiting for the inevitable invalid account or balance to points dollars to appear in giant red font, a digital scarlet letter for the boy who dared to dream. The teller's brow furrowed. She hit the enter key with a definitive strike, and for a heartbeat the entire system seemed to catch its breath. The main monitor, which usually displayed rolling advertisements for offshore investment funds, suddenly flickered and went dark. A soft rhythmic chime, a sound Janet had never heard in her 15 years at the Imperial, began to pulse from the speakers. It wasn't an alarm, but a notification of extreme priority. Janet's eyes widened as the screen finally began to populate with data. The color drained from her lips, her professional mask cracking to reveal a look of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked from the screen to the small, soot-stained boy, and then back to the monitor, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the mahogany counter to stay upright. The silence in the lobby was now absolute, broken only by the steady, haunting pulse of the computer's high-clearance alert. Rich Ponce leaned forward, his smug grin wavering for the first time as he sensed the tectonic plates of his world beginning to shift. The golden chime that began to pulse through the lobby was not the aggressive shriek of a fire alarm. It was a deep, resonant tone, the sound of a system recognizing a ghost. As the sound vibrated through the marble floor, the bank's primary monitors, dozens of them lining the walls, simultaneously froze. The stock tickers that usually danced with the frantic energy of the market turned into static, then went black. Rich Ponce's smile didn't vanish all at once. It eroded, his lips twitching as the amusement in his eyes was replaced by the instinctive, cold prickle of a man who realized the predator in the room might not be him. Janet's terminal didn't just display a number, it struggled to contain one. The loading bar at the center of her screen moved in agonizing, jagged hitches, as if the bank's mainframe was straining under the weight of the data it had just unlocked. A prompt appeared in the center of the screen, flashing in a deep, authoritative crimson. Level 9 override. Contact trustee immediately. Janet tried to click out of the window, but her mouse was locked. Every workstation in the lobby followed suit, the teller's screens turning into mirrors of her own. What is this, Janet? Some kind of prank. Rich's voice had lost its melodic authority. It was now tight, rising in pitch as he looked around at the flickering lights. The system is lagging because of a dirty piece of paper. Fix it. My time is worth more than this glitch. But Janet wasn't listening. She was staring at the total assets field that had begun to populate in the background behind the security prompt. The numbers were scrolling upward so fast they were a blur of white light. It was a digital tally of decades of interest, compounding in the dark, protected by a trust so old it predated the bank's current ownership. The silence among the clients had turned from judgmental to suffocating. The woman in pearls took a step back, her hand moving from her mouth to her throat, sensing a shift in the room's temperature. The air conditioning seemed to roar in the sudden absence of human speech. John Wayman remained the only still point in the turning world. He didn't look at the flashing lights or the panicked tellers. He simply kept his eyes on his duct-taped sneakers, his small hand still buried in his pocket, fingering the worn edge of his mother's photograph. He felt the shift in the air, the way the lobby's elitist oxygen had suddenly become thin and toxic for the man standing next to him. The chime grew louder, more insistent, and then, with a final definitive clack from the central server, every light in the building pulsed once and dimmed. The system didn't just freeze, it surrendered. The main monitor directly behind the counter flickered back to life, but it no longer showed the weather or the S&P 500. It displayed a single massive account name in elegant serif gold lettering, the Wayman Foundation and Estate, followed by a string of digits that refused to end. Rich Ponce stared at the screen, his face turning a sickly ashen grey as he realized the street rat wasn't just a client, he was the landlord. The golden lettering on the monitor seemed to burn into the retinas of everyone present. Rich Ponce stood paralyzed, his eyes darting across the screen, trying to find the decimal point that would make sense of the chaos. He waited for the system to correct itself, for the thousands to turn into hundreds, for the joke to finally land. But the numbers didn't move. They sat there, cold and immovable, anchored by a dollar sign that looked like a weapon. $47 million. And that was just the liquid balance of the primary trust. Below it, in smaller lethal text, the screen listed the auxiliary assets, the real estate holdings, the majority shares in the bank's parent corporation, and the deed to the very land the building occupied. Rich felt a sudden violent vertigo. The 11 zeros following the first two digits weren't just numbers, they were a wall, high and impenetrable, and he had spent the last 10 minutes throwing stones at it. His laughter didn't just die, it was strangled. The smug, bared teeth grin he had worn like a mask fell away, leaving his face slack and grey. His manicured hands, which had been so steady while mocking a child, began to tremble with such intensity that he had to shove them into the pockets of his expensive suit. The silence in the lobby had evolved from a tense wait into a heavy funerary stillness. The woman in the pearls had turned away, her face burning with a shame that was now contagious. Rich looked at John Wayman. The soot on the boy's face no longer looked like dirt, it looked like the war paint of a survivor. The duct tape on his sneakers no longer signaled poverty, it signaled a grit that Rich, with his inherited millions and easy victories, could never hope to possess. The boy was no longer a prop in Rich's play, he was the owner of the theatre, the stage and the actor himself. She was staring at a secondary notification that had appeared on her terminal, a digital greeting reserved only for the highest tier of the Wayman lineage. It was a prompt that required a biometric signature to unlock the daily management tasks, and it was addressed to Master John. Rich took a stumbling step back, his heel catching on the edge of the marble inlay. He realized with a sickening jolt that his own billion-dollar empire was largely built on credit lines and commercial leases held by this very institution. If this boy, this child he had called a street rat, simply closed his eyes and nodded, Rich's entire life could be liquidated by noon. The invitation he had extended to John to see his worth had been accepted, and the bill was now due. Rich Ponce, the king of the lobby, looked down at his polished shoes and realized he was standing on ground that no longer belonged to him. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 7, where the bank president makes his dramatic descent to meet the true owner? The silence of the lobby was shattered not by an alarm, but by the sharp, rhythmic chime of the executive elevator, a sound rarely heard on the main floor. The doors, etched with frosted gold, slid open to reveal Arthur Sterling, the president of Grand Imperial Bank.
Sterling was a man whose presence usually signaled the arrival of a world leader or a merger of nations. He moved with a focused, frantic energy that bypassed every receptionist and security guard, his eyes locked on the small, soot-stained figure standing at the VIP counter. Rich Ponce, seeing a familiar face of his own social standing, felt a momentary surge of relief. He stepped forward, his hand extended as he prepared to regain control of the narrative. "Arthur, thank God you're here. There's been a massive system malfunction, some kind of security breach involving this kid and his fake account. I was just telling Janet that we need to call the authorities, and Sterling didn't just ignore the hand. He moved through Rich as if the billionaire were made of thin air. He didn't offer a glance or a word of acknowledgement." The king of the lobby was brushed aside with the casual indifference one might show a piece of discarded furniture. Sterling came to a halt directly in front of John Wayman and did something that stopped the breath of every client in the room. He bowed. "Master Wayman," Sterling said, his voice thick with a reverence that bordered on fear, "I cannot express the depth of my apology for the delay. We were alerted the moment your code was scanned, but I had to personally verify the black-level protocols. It has been many years since a member of your family has graced this hall." Rich Ponce stood frozen, his hand still hanging in mid-air. He looked like a man who had been struck by lightning, but hadn't realized he was dead yet. He watched, paralyzed, as the bank president reached out, not to grab the boy, but to gently offer his arm. "The main floor is no place for a client of your stature, sir," Sterling continued, his eyes briefly flicking with visible disgust toward the spot where Rich stood. "I have prepared the Imperial Suite. It is private, secure, and far removed from the common noise." The bank staff stood in a rigid line, their heads bowed in a synchronized display of respect that Rich had spent a lifetime and millions of dollars trying to earn. He had bought their service, but John Wayman, in his duct-taped sneakers and smudged face, owned their souls. Sterling began to guide the boy toward the private elevators, walking at a pace that matched John's small, hesitant steps. Rich tried to speak, his voice coming out as a dry, pathetic croak. "Arthur, he's a street kid. Look at his clothes, he's got dirt on." Sterling stopped. He didn't turn around, but his voice went cold, echoing with a finality that signaled the end of Rich Ponce's era at Grand Imperial. "Mr. Ponce, you are currently speaking to the majority shareholder of this institution. If I were you, I would spend the next few minutes considering the tone of your next sentence. It may be the last one you ever utter inside this building." With a soft hiss, the golden doors of the executive elevator closed, sealing John and the president inside. Rich was left standing in the center of the marble floor, a billionaire suddenly rendered invisible, surrounded by the silence of a lobby that had already forgotten.
Rich Ponce stood in the center of the lobby. A man who had suddenly discovered the floor beneath his $5,000 shoes was made of glass, and it was cracking. The silence of the room was no longer the respectful hush of the elite. It was the sound of a vacuum, an emptiness where his influence used to be. He looked at the closed elevator doors and then at the faces of the other clients. The woman in pearls was no longer tittering. She was looking at him with the cold, detached curiosity one might afford a car crash. When the elevator doors opened again 10 minutes later, Rich didn't wait. He scrambled toward the exit of the Imperial Suite, his movements frantic and devoid of his usual grace. He intercepted the small group as they emerged, Sterling, 2 stone-faced security details, and the boy. John Wayman looked different now. He was still wearing the soot and the duct-taped shoes, but he was wrapped in a plush navy blue executive coat Sterling had clearly fetched from upstairs to ward off the lobby's chill. "John, Master Wayman," Rich stammered, his voice cracking, a sound of pure desperation. He dropped to one knee, a pathetic imitation of the respect Sterling had shown earlier. He reached out as if to touch the boy's sleeve, then pulled back, his hands shaking. I was just joking, a bit of light-hearted hazing between men of means. I see now the strength of your character. Please let me make it up to you. Anything you need, a new wardrobe, the best schools, a home. I'll personally oversee your transition into your rightful place." John stopped. He looked down at the billionaire kneeling before him. For a moment, Rich felt a spark of hope. He thought he could buy his way out of the hole he had dug. He thought an apology fueled by a checkbook would bridge the gap. But John's eyes were as cold as the marble floor. He wasn't looking at a mentor or a repentant man. He was looking at a predator who had only stopped biting because he realized his prey was made of iron. John reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn photograph of his mother, holding it so Rich could see her tired, beautiful smile. "You're not sorry," John said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. You were laughing when you thought I was a street rat. You were laughing when you thought my mother was a failure. You're only kneeling now because the screen told you I own the building you work in." Rich began to protest, the words misunderstanding and honor tumbling out of his mouth in a frantic slurry. John didn't let him finish. He turned his gaze to Arthur Sterling, who was standing like a gargoyle of judgment behind the boy. "Mr. Sterling," John asked, his voice steady, "does the Wayman Foundation have a policy about who we do business with?" "We do, sir," Sterling replied, his eyes fixed on Rich with a terrifying lack of emotion. "We prioritize integrity and character. We do not associate with those who bring disrepute to the institution." "Then close his accounts," John said simply. "All of them." By the end of the day, Rich's face went a shade of white that shouldn't be possible on a living person. Closing his accounts didn't just mean a change of banks. It meant the immediate calling of his massive commercial loans, the freezing of his credit lines, and the public signaling that Rich Ponce was no longer a protected man. In 10 words, the boy had dismantled the empire Rich had spent 40 years building on the backs of others. John didn't wait for the scream that he knew was coming. He turned and walked toward the revolving doors, the squeak of his duct-taped shoes the only sound in the tomb-like lobby. Rich Ponce remained on his knees, a billionaire in a suit that suddenly felt like a shroud, realizing too late that the only thing more expensive than his shoes was his own cruelty. Chap 9. The heavy revolving doors of the Grand Imperial Bank pushed open one last time, releasing John Wayman back into the sweltering heat of the Manhattan afternoon. The transition was jarring. Behind him lay the silent, air-conditioned sanctuary of marble and gold. Ahead of him lay the roar of traffic, the smell of exhaust, and the vibrant, chaotic pulse of the city that had tried so hard to ignore him. He felt the weight of the new navy blue coat on his shoulders, a gift from Sterling that felt far too heavy for the summer sun, but he didn't take it off. It felt like a shield. He didn't call for a limousine or wait for the security detail Sterling had offered to arrange. Instead, John began to walk. His duct-taped sneakers, which had been an object of mockery just an hour ago, felt light against the pavement. He reached into his pocket and touched the worn photograph of his mother again. For the first time since she had passed, the image didn't just bring a sharp pang of grief, it brought a sense of completion. He understood now why she had stayed up late at the library, why she had skipped meals, and why she had scrubbed every inch of that bank's lobby with such meticulous care. She wasn't just cleaning a floor, she was buying his freedom. John's destination wasn't a penthouse or a luxury dealership. He navigated the grid of the city until the glass towers began to shorten into the brick and fire escapes of his own neighborhood. He stopped at a corner bodega where the metal gate was halfway down, the same place where Mrs. Chen had apologetically denied him credit for a loaf of bread only 24 hours earlier. The bell chimed as he entered, and Mrs. Chen looked up, her face weary. Her eyes widened as she saw the boy in the expensive coat with the soot-streaked face. Before she could speak, John placed his bank card on the counter, the black card that carried the weight of a legacy. "I want to pay my tab, Mrs. Chen," he said softly, "and I want to pay for everyone else's too, for the next month. Just tell them it's from the lady who used to clean the bank." As the shopkeeper stared in stunned silence at the terminal, John stepped back outside. He saw a homeless man he recognized, a veteran who sat on the same crate every day, and John realized that the millions in his account weren't just a balance, they were a responsibility. His mother had taught him that real wealth wasn't the ability to look down on others, but the power to lift them up. He finally understood that he hadn't walked into that bank to become like Rich Ponce. He had walked in to ensure no one else would ever have to feel as small as Rich Ponce had tried to make him. Back in the lobby of the Grand Imperial, the atmosphere remained stagnant. Rich Ponce sat on a leather bench, his head in his hands. The silence of the room, once his favorite attribute, now felt like a physical pressure. He could feel the eyes of the staff on him, not with the usual fear or admiration, but with a clinical, detached pity. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, likely his lawyers or his board members reacting to the sudden, catastrophic shift in his credit rating. He looked at the spot where the boy had stood, then down at his own manicured hands. He had everything the world told him he should want: the suit, the watch, the name on the billboards, and yet in the wake of a 7-year-old's exit, he felt utterly bankrupt. The shame wasn't just about the money he was losing, it was the sudden, horrifying realization of the man he had become. He had been so busy measuring everyone else's worth that he had failed to notice his own soul had been empty for years. As the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the marble floor, Rich Ponce remained in the lobby, a ghost in a designer suit. Miles away, in a dimly lit apartment, John Wayman sat with his sister Emma, sharing a meal that was finally enough. He looked at her and smiled, knowing that while the world would now call him a billionaire, he was finally rich for the only reason that mattered. He was his mother's son.